You're listening to episode 215 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Keith Nielsen joins us to speak about secular Buddhism in Houston, Texas. Secular Buddhism continues to grow and flourish, distinguishing itself from traditional forms with its focus on this world, while honoring the core values and practices of Buddhist thought. New groups continue to sprout as the notion of secular, well, being Buddhist, transitions from oddity to commonplace. That growing can only take place with the efforts of those who practice, as we do our best to model those values every day. Our guest, Keith Nielsen, is a meditator and secular Buddhist, actively building a community of fellow meditators in Houston. So sit back, relax, and have a nice smoky julep. And our guest today is Keith Nielsen. Keith, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, how's it going?
Glad to have you here. Finally, I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time, and we're here to talk about your Houston Secular Buddhists group. But first, let's start by having you tell us a bit about your background.
All right. Well, originally I was raised Catholic, which I was until I reached the age of reason. Then I was kind of an unsophisticated atheist for a while. Then I spent 17 years in occultism and paganism of various flavors until I finally came out the other side, much more informed atheist, but I still had some respect for, I guess Sam Harris would call it, spiritual matters. And so I, via him, there was something on his page about how to meditate. And, I'd already had some experience with that from when I was an occultist. And he had just a simple little essay, but he also name-checked Stephen Batchelor. And from there, I checked out, Buddhism Without Beliefs.
Confession of a Buddhist Atheist.
Confession of a Buddhist Atheist, right? And then from there, I found your podcast. And so then I was off and running.
Excellent. So tell us a little bit more about, as a secular Buddhist, because that's a little bit different than what the tradition has seen. What does that mean to you, and how does that look in your practice in your life?
To me, it's, I find the meditative practices that are contained within to be useful, and all you have to do is do them and see if they work. You don't have to believe that there's all these strange worlds associated with just, focus on your breathing, see how it works. And I like the ethical approach that's in early Buddhism. It's basically sometimes things suck and here's how you can deal with it and get past it. But I'm also a big fan of Epicureanism, Stoicism, all of what Jennifer Michael Hecht in Doubt called the graceful life philosophies. Frankly, it could have been called anything, but secular Buddhism is the specific stuff I was reading at the time. And so that's what I named it.
So let's talk a little bit about the Houston Secular Buddhist. Tell us what that is.
For most of the past year or so, it's been just a Facebook group I created with the hope of eventually having a face-to-face kind of monthly meetup group. We did have one at the very beginning, just at a bar, but it was a bit too loud. So for most of its existence, it's been me and other people posting articles, things to think about, jokes, parody stuff because I don't take anything seriously if I can help it. And it's been a somewhat useful discussion group, but now I'm getting into a place where I'm going to start having actual events. I think within the next month or two. It got pushed back a little bit because rooming situation, but I figure what I'm going to start with is once a month bowling events. Just meet in a bowling alley, maybe hole away somewhere for 15 minutes, do a little guided meditation, and then we just bowl and talk about Buddhist topics or really whatever comes up. And also kicking around a book club idea to go with that.
Sounds great. And one of the things I like about that is that there aren't a lot of social in-person secular Buddhist things going on where we can talk about our own stuff. I mean, our site, we have our own social circle once a month online, but an in-person bowling thing sounds like a blast. That's a great idea.
Plus, I get to bring the whole Dudism, Big Lebowski angle in that way.
You can have a Lebowski prize for your first meetup. Are you going to be using tools like Meetup to advertise this?
I haven't decided if I'm going to use Meetup or just use the event function that's already built into the Facebook group. I think at least to begin with, I'm going to do that. I'll see if I need to go to Meetup, but I don't know. I've been in some other groups that are centered around Facebook, and with the event function, I don't really see the need to go beyond that.
Yeah, it looks like you've got at this point over 90 people.
I'd say there's about 90 or so people, but the people who interact regularly are a much smaller subset than that. But hey, if the lurkers haven't left, I'm assuming they're enjoying what they're reading.
So you're also kind of uniquely situated. You're in Houston, and that's got to be a little different and present its own challenges for you. Have you run into any of that, or what have been some of the challenges for you with the group?
In terms of it's because it's the Bible Belt and whatnot?
Anything at all, or even just your own practice. But I would suspect that there's some challenges at being in the Bible Belt, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm also in Houston Atheists, and I've dealt with a lot more difficulty with that. That's also primarily a meetup group in town. And I've actually done some secular Buddhist stuff via that a long time ago. I don't know. Like I said, so far the Houston secular Buddhist thing has mostly been an online presence. So there hasn't been any real specific difficulties. I mean, frankly, if I say to people I'm a Buddhist, whether I put secular in front of it or not, they're just like, yeah, whatever. If I say atheist, then they're like, oh. So, I mean, the Buddhist thing is actually milder than hearing atheist, but they're both true for me.
We're not quite as threatening when we use the B word as when we also honestly identify with the A word as well.
Yeah. I mean, then they're like, what? At best, you'll get like, what's the secular part mean? It means I don't believe in reincarnation or karma, but I like the ethics and the meditation. And they're like, oh, okay. And that's about it.
Yeah. And I would think that for a lot of the people you may find yourself in discussion with, that actually makes it a little more appealing, because that would be something that's in alignment with their own beliefs. Like, oh, yeah, I don't believe that stuff either.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, I probably get more resistance to it from past associates who are still of a new age, pagan kind of, hell, even traditional Buddhist mindset than I do from anybody else.
Are you expecting you might get some continuing crossover as you get things a little more active with the group from your atheist colleagues in Houston?
Oh, yeah. And, I have a lot of my close friends from that group. They're, whether they participate or not, they're on the roster so they can see what I'm up to. As I build up to more actual in-person events, yeah, I expect if I can do it consistently, and I figure starting once a month shouldn't be too difficult to pull off, then, I'll eventually build a decent enough showing. So I'm not too worried about it. I'm just like, screw it. I'm going to start going to a place, set up a couple of lanes, bowl. If people show up, great. If not, I'll just enjoy my White Russian and bowl.
I'm trying to picture the bowling shirts. I think you're going to have an awesome time with that.
Yeah, if I get enough people to show up to like more than 2 or 3 sessions in a row, I'll definitely consider making up some bowling shirts for it, because I like that idea.
So, Keith, in the work that you've been doing with secular Buddhism and where you're located, and just knowing how challenging it is to start these and to keep them going, that it takes a lot out of your life. There's also some highlights and some good things that come out of it. I'm wondering if there are some things that have happened that have been inspirational, or some of the things that you've liked about this process and standing this up.
Well, I can tell you that even though my mindfulness practice has been sporadic at best, I cannot brag to any kind of discipline in that area because of even that little bit. When I recently started doing cognitive behavioral therapy for my anxiety and depression, the fact that I was already used to noticing thoughts as they arise and not grabbing onto them, but kind of having I don't want to say an outside perspective, but it's almost like that. It made going through the process of CBT really easy, because that first step of identifying the thoughts is the hardest one. And because of the mindfulness practice, it was easy.
Yeah. I've heard that from many people that have gone through DBT or CBT or ACT or MBCT, that, there are aspects to this. If they've had a practice, even if it's an old one that they need to dust off, just the concept of observing thoughts or observing breath and bringing yourself back to just the vividness of experience, of sensation, it's already there. And there's a little bit of a template set up, and that becomes not so hard as it is for folks who just don't really get the concept yet. That's a brand new thing for them.
Yeah, it's been really good for me. I think now that I've combined the mindfulness with the CBT, I'm way better now at remaining in the present moment, not having too many expectations, and I'm way more content than I used to be. It's like there's still stuff that occurs that bothers me a little bit. Like, right now I'm not seeing anybody. I'd like to be seeing someone, but I'm already dealing with the fact of the matter. I don't have to deal with the constant dwelling and running it over in my head that the anxiety forces me into. Now I'm like, okay, whatever, put that out of my head. And it's so much easier to deal with now. I mean, it's like I know I teach suffering and the way out of suffering. It's like, okay, I'm starting to get that in, visceral terms now. I'm in a much better place than I have been in like 20 years because of the combination.
That's awesome. And I'm so happy for you to hear that. Because, you've been facing some challenges and you've been getting through them.
Yeah, I tend to post a lot of stuff in the group and cross-post it from my wall, just because a lot of it has to do with meditation and various things. So I post stuff from my blog on the group, and, I get decent feedback from it. So I do hope to get the group to the point where it's not primarily me posting all the time, but, you got to start somewhere. So I'm not too broken up about it.
You do. I give it some time. And that's, I think, one of the things that I admire about you, Keith, and why I'm so glad that we're finally talking is you've been out there for a while. And one of the things that's been most impressive about that is the sustaining of this, that you've been maintaining that. And it doesn't mean you post every day. It doesn't mean you're constantly having meetups. It doesn't mean that. But you're still there. You're still involved with it. And for a lot of groups, as we were talking before we started the interview, that isn't always the case. And particularly when you're flying solo on this effort, which for now you are, and that may change. I hope it does in the future. Just to keep that going is in itself a pretty big accomplishment. You don't lose sight of that, because that's a big deal. It really is.
Well, I mean, I figure regardless of what hell, half the time I consider changing the name to Houston Secular Dudists, just because I'm such a pop culture junkie. And frankly, I like using pop culture to illustrate the same lessons you're going to find in the Buddhist texts and the Epicurean texts. I mean, a lot of the same points are made in pop culture stuff like, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Buckaroo Banzai, The Big Lebowski. And I mean, if you actually look at the old stories in context, I mean, it's not like they're not using things that would have been notions that were pop culture for their original time, 2,500 years ago. So to me, it's like recapitulating the process by throwing in a bunch of Lebowski jokes and whatever, because you can actually bypass through, like, you start reading some of the poly texts and it's just repetitive and it goes on and on and on, and you're just like, start. But then it's like you pop in a goofy ass time travel movie. It's like, be excellent to each other, party on. It's like, that's some commandments I can go with.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Pali Canon, in reading that, we understand the repetition. It was an oral tradition. Totally get what.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why it does it. Just for today, it's dry.
It's a bit challenging, but what I find very interesting in the suttas, and I like this in a recent interview we did with the Simple Suttas podcast founder, is that those metaphors, those stories, make it much more, as the word you used earlier, it makes it very visceral. We immediately get it. And so having references like, Star Wars references, you need to do your training with Obi-Wan before you start your training with Yoda. You kind of get it. There's a progression of teaching.
But it goes on. You got to unlearn your bad habits and such. And yeah.
So for folks who are listening to the podcast, you can find out more about Houston secular Buddhists. We'll be linking the Facebook page on the episode page for this episode. I'm hoping for a bowling shirt. I want to see those designs soon because that's kind of cool. I'd love to see that.
We'll get on that. And I got some artist friends that I'll see about coming up with a design.
Outstanding. Thanks. If it can be as good as the Bruins hockey team's subtle Buddhist, they've got a big Dharma wheel and a big B for Buddhist. They say it's Bruins, but I know it's Buddhist. It's got to be. With the Dharma wheel behind it, it's got to be. Keith, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
It's all good.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.